Yeah, I think I've done more podcasts than filming. Occasionally podcast interviews, sort of. When I do a book or something, people seem to want to do that.
Yeah. Oh, that's better. Okay, good. Musicologist.
Well, different people describe me differently. That's one of the fun things about the area I work in. So I had different emails from different people this week. One described me as a musicologist, one described me as a theologian, and it's hard to say what I am anymore. Within a worship environment, I think there was always a little bit of a tension for me. That this kind of popular music worship, it wasn't my background. I came from a classical background and I was studying historical musicology. And I think a lot of times I was sort of curious, okay, how do those things relate to each other? Is all of my life present in this, or is there something else as well? And for a long time, that tension wasn't a particularly pronounced tension. It was okay. It's sort of sitting there in the background. I'm enjoying this, what we're doing in the church. I'm getting really into it, and there's this other part of my life over there. I think at some point it became a bit more of a tension. I think partly as I spend more time in that kind of environment, but also as that kind of environment changed around me. So when I first joined this congregation in Oxford, you had a slightly eclectic musical culture in that, okay, it was everything with a worship band, but we would make sure we always started and ended with a hymn. We would have some older worship songs alongside the newer ones. We would have room for different instruments. And there was that little push in the direction of diversity. I think over time, that diversity sort of closed down a bit. I think they had a stronger sense they wanted a really core and focused musical identity. And as that became a bit more focused, I think that tension in my own life then became a bit more pronounced, because I was thinking, actually, I don't like the fact that this is crowding other things out.
So who was, you said they were deciding that the music would be more focused. Who's they? What's the...
Or who makes decisions in a big church environment? I think it's a difficult question. I think there's paid worship staff, and they have a certain amount of decision-making authority. I don't think they always feel free to make those decisions themselves. I think they feel a lot of pressures from different directions to conform to what's expected of them, either from other leaders or from broader networks or from the wider congregation. So I think the worship staff in the church are often the ones that sort of execute the decisions and say, okay, this is what we're doing. I'm not sure whether they're always the ones that feel that was a free choice that they made, though.
So practically, let's talk about... So it was one thing,
yeah,
and then whoever was involved in making this decision, which seems a bit amorphic still, what was that focused musical start? Was it style? Was it approach? Was it... what was it? Because you said that then unsettled you. So give me a bit of an idea of what that change was, like quite practically or specifically.
I mean, I don't know whether I should name names or whether that's... But so at some point we had a changeover in worship staff at our church. So there'd been someone that was heading it up who had been sort of come up from within the congregation, and I think had been part of the congregation for quite some time and had a certain way of handling things. And then at some point the rector decided... when they appointed a new one, they wanted someone with a bit of a bigger name, someone that had an album contract, someone that could make our music a bit more polished, a bit more the kind of thing that maybe you could sell to people on an album, the kind of thing that
draws people. Then.
Draws people, I suppose.
Because
yes.
You don't make an album unless you can sell it.
Yeah.
You don't polish something unless you can show it.
And so that happened, and a changeover of staff brings a change of culture. And there were good things that happened with that change of culture. I think you noticed the standard of the music did change. We became more polished in what we did. We started operating, I think, according to a slightly different model of who played together with whom in bands. I think previously that had been a bit more amorphous, and we had slightly more fixed setups. We started meeting together more regularly as a group of musicians to try and really build something as a team together. But there was also a review of our repertoire, and in that review of the repertoire, a lot of the older things sort of fell out. A lot of the hymns fell out, and we ended up with something I think that conformed a lot more to worship industry norms, a lot more sort of soul survivor repertoire, a lot more Hillsong repertoire, sort of those core sort of things, and all the 60s, 70s vineyard stuff, that wasn't there anymore. That wasn't, well, maybe that was too cheesy for us now, or...
And did you, so there was obviously a strategic decision in that.
I think
That's
so.
what you're highlighting.
Yeah.
And was that strategy, what were the fruits of the strategy? Did the church grow in number? Did you sell a bunch of albums? And also, what was your role? What were you in this?
What was my role? I was there sort of being, I guess, a sort of critical friend. I was still part of things, and I would make my voice heard when I wasn't necessarily happy with something. I played... Yeah, that changed over time too. At the beginning, I used to play flute and saxophone. I think as we changed to sort of these new norms, those weren't necessarily quite so needed as before. I switched more to playing keys. Yeah, and I sort of... I would say, yeah, where have these old things gone that I think we should still have? What are we doing here? And we would have a sort of light-hearted back and forth about it. I knew my voice was heard to a certain degree, but that was a strategy that wouldn't necessarily act upon it. That would say, okay, yeah, I hear that, but that's not what we're doing. We're going in this direction. And I came along with that.
And so that could simply be where... And you mentioned earlier where you would play flute.
Yes.
And someone afterwards would thank you and say, that was really significant for me.
Yeah.
And you knew that had significance and you're gifting in that. And now you're being told there's not space for flute in a Hillsong song.
Not told directly, but gradually the feeling that flute playing that had previously been very useful wasn't necessarily the thing that was useful right now. A modern worship album wouldn't have a flute on it. It doesn't necessarily fit so well into that kind of sound. So I'm going to find a different role, and that's going to become my main emphasis. I mean, flute was still there a bit, but you notice that there was a change there. Yeah.
Okay, so that sort of period happened, over the course of a few months or whatever?
I suppose, yeah, months, a couple of years maybe.
Okay.
But
while you were studying at university at Oxford?
And after that.
Okay. And what were you doing then? So you'd graduated?
Graduated, yeah.
But you were still living in Oxford. What were you doing?
All sorts of things. I did some freelance music teaching. I worked for a magazine, sort of doing various office tasks, worked for a data consultancy, and at some point I got bored of that and went back and did a master's to try and integrate music and theology a bit.
Oh, interesting, right. So within this sort of church world and having to make a crust world,
yeah.
What was then? You said something was challenged in you in this process. So what was it in you? So you've spoken about the environment that was challenging very clearly. What was it in you that was then challenged?
I mean, I think over the years that sense that maybe it was possible to do something different with worship music sort of grew in me, and I was wondering, okay, what are the alternatives? Is the possibility, for example, there were a couple of people at HTB that were talking about incorporating classical music alongside worship music, and I sort of found that exciting. Maybe this culture is missing an element. Maybe that's something we could try out. Or maybe I should go and visit some of the alternative worship groups that are there on the Oxford scene. Maybe they're doing something interesting. I'll go and see what they're experimenting with. And buying albums, sort of discovering, okay, now and again there's a worship album that does something a bit differently from the repertoire we're doing, that incorporates a bit of jazz or goes in a bit more of a soul direction, or does some retuned hymns or something, and sort of thinking, okay, there are these things and I like those. I'm going to keep them on my radar and think about alternatives.
Why? Why were you doing so? For me, I was someone who, and I was thinking, even the questions that you were asking in 2012 of people when you did your research over that stuff, I was thinking if you asked me some of the questions, but rather than talk about your research, unless you think it totally, I was thinking for me when I was growing up, when I was right through my 20s, still involved in church, I don't think I ever really bought a Christian album.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think, not one, whether it's worship or Christian. There was a real duality in me. There was this sort of, I loved incredible sort of muso bands.
Yeah.
That was kind of what did it for me. All of the things like I love guitar, but I would really enjoy incredibly accomplished guitarists. And I rarely heard that in the sort of the contemporary worship or Christian music stuff. I'm sure it was out there, but for me it was not something. So you're someone very different. You were always trying to look for, and why were you looking for it that you would listen to it and it would enable you to draw nearer to God, or whether that's theologically the right thing to say, but enable you to pray better, or did you want to buy those because it would enable you and facilitate your worship leading of other people, or both? Or
I don't know if it was either. I think it's just this sense, okay, this is exciting. It makes me feel alive to hear something a bit different. And I looked for that in a Christian market, I guess because my Christian faith was important to me. I grew up buying albums, I suppose, but classical music albums. My entry to popular music was through Christian popular music. And so when I looked for alternative popular music formats, it was within that sort of sphere that I found I was most interested in doing it.
So in some respects then, what the church was doing, you understood, because you were kind of doing that anyway. You were looking for music that engaged you and that made you excited, in the same way that as a church maybe they were looking to figure out a style that connected with the people. Is that fair?
Maybe. I don't know whether I would frame what the church was doing in those terms. Were they looking for something that connected with the people? I think they were looking for something that would draw people to the church.
Yeah.
Definitely. Whether they necessarily expected the kind of connection I was looking for in my own journey, I don't know.
Okay. So, but you still said that it challenged you, it wrong-footed you, this process. So what did it wrong-foot?
I suppose, just this emerging sense of dissatisfaction, that there's a lot of things we could be doing, a lot of creativity we could be exploring, a lot of different realms of musical activity that we're just not interested in. And then the question for me was, okay, why aren't we interested in them? I'm interested in these. Can I find spaces where there are people that are interested in them? Wouldn't it enrich our worship if we had some of this diversity present within it? And I think that was, maybe that was the thought, that actually, yeah, that would enrich our worship. That would do something good. And I think we should do something like that. Okay, the church doesn't think that. Maybe that's just me sort of being odd.
Or do you think it's down to your... I mean, I'm trying to think of an example. I mean, no, I could just still use music. So I have a friend who is exceptional on the guitar. I mean, he teaches, but he can put his mind to something and learn, whether it's flamenco or classical,
Yep.
whether it's jazz or metal. I mean, he can do the whole gambit. When we play together, my playing ability raises.
Yep.
And it's great. It's lovely. He carries me to some extent. I'm not terrible. I've got a reasonable ear, but he lifts my ability. Now, if I wanted him to play with me what I wanted to do, he would have to slow down.
Yeah.
You know, he's not going to get into top gear here. He's going to stay in first and second. there's very often what I've seen in the past, and I know it through bands, whether they're Christian or not. There's a you need to tone it down in order to work with me, and that's an ability thing, not a stylistic thing.
But so I think in the church, there's more than that. Okay. And I think in worship music, in the worship music scene, there are people that occasionally sort of bring something, and it's made very clear to you, worship isn't a space for showing off, right? You're not meant to bring anything that would draw attention to the music. If you have a gifting that sort of would point in a slightly different direction, you almost shouldn't bring that in worship. It would be bad, because doing something too musically exciting or interesting would distract people from the core task of worship, which is this sort of heart relationship with God.
And okay, what's so this is one thing we can start taking apart. So you look at gospel music, it's the complete reverse.
Yeah.
Or as you were saying, as you were playing a flute, that's the complete reverse, because the melody that you will play will have detail and it will be interesting and tonal stuff. You're not just playing, the root notes.
Yep.
So where does that come from? That you can't, if I put a different language on it, we don't want you to shine, because you'll be distracting everyone from their experience or their worship of God.
Well, also, we don't want people to notice the music. The music has to vanish. It's got to be there, but not so much that you notice that it's there as music. Because if it becomes too present, then that'll take away from this you God thing. There's no...
Where does that come from? So I remember, actually, you just made me... A line you quoted, or a phrase you quoted, was it the God pad or something?
Oh, yeah. Well, the Holy Spirit pad, I think people talk about a lot.
Okay. So where does this come from? What is this teaching, and why is... I know it's familiar to me. I'm not listening and thinking, gosh, that sounds controlling.
Yeah.
Although I can say, gosh, that sounds controlling. Where does that come from? What's the root of that? What's the theology of that?
Yeah. I don't know if that's an easy question. That feels quite... you trace it back. I think there's lots of different things that feed into that. I think for me, a lot of the things that forms the way we talk about worship music, they come from this early period of worship wars, where we're contesting the role of popular music in worship, and where some people are saying, no, guitars are demonic, get them out of our churches, and some people are saying, no, we're going to let them in, we want them in. And that's a long time ago now that we were really having those arguments. I guess, the 60s, 70s, these arguments were big, and in the States they were a lot bigger and more ferocious than over here, I think.
They probably had their guns.
I think, yeah.
Why I'm interested in exploring this is, if you think you could apply that then to how you disciple people, it then becomes a really interesting... I don't want you, Mark, to be noticed. You're here to be part of the scenery, so that God can be... Because in some respects, what's bizarre is that's the negative space of that is saying you can get in the way of God. Yeah. Which is kind of just a bit bizarre.
But so I think some of the way that popular music made its way into the church, you have to sort of justify it. I think historically people have this idea there's a different church style. There's a way of doing music that is holy, sacred, and that's set apart in some way from other music. It's more complicated than that. There's always been this back and forth between church music and culture, but I think some of that sense has become sort of embedded in our traditions. And so when you're smuggling in another form of music, there's this... a lot of the suspicion early on was, okay, this music is bad. It's associated with sex, with drugs, with demons, with whatever. And so is this music inherently bad? It's a worldly form of church. It's a worldly form of music that has no place in the church. And part of the strategy for allowing that in is to say, okay, no, music's not inherently ethically loaded. It's not that this way of doing music is inherently associated with all those things. Actually, music is a neutral medium and has no sort of qualities of its own. You use it for a particular purpose, and that purpose gives it meaning. And so you bring music into the church as a neutral medium that allows people to then address God through it. And that, I think that step in itself has erased a lot of the music, because in order to allow it in, you've had to erase it to a certain degree and say it's just a medium for something else.
Sort of make it magnolia.
It's just a means to an end, yeah.
So we don't want colour on these walls. We need magnolia because people don't notice magnolia.
I mean, part of using popular music in church is to say, okay, we're going to use the music of people's everyday lives. We're going to use this background music and we're going to use it for the gospel.
I'm still kind of interested in, only because it was my thought, but I'm still quite interested in that idea that the need to control whether it's the melody or the instrument, whether it's the arrangement or the song itself of how it's written, because we don't want it to be distracting.
Yeah.
Is then taken into the prayer ministry. Using Soul Survivor as the example. So you went in 2002 to the festival. That control on the music of not going outside of whatever containment that's been created for it is important. But then that containment for prayer ministry is the same. That containment for the length of the talk, that containment then starts stretching to what that person can do with their lives, who their friends should be, who they might marry, where they might live, their loyalty to the church. All of those things seem to be quite, to me, I haven't thought of this like this before, but there seems to be a universal control on, or at least a top-down kind of thing. There doesn't seem to be a democratizing of people and doing things. That it seems to be very didactically controlled. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
And so is that what your understanding is of church music? I mean, am I being?
I think worship music does end up doing that a lot, and I think these things are all coupled together, right? The musics you allow in a church are to do with the voices, the expressions you allow to be heard, the ways you allow people to feel, the kinds of expression you allow them to give voice to. And if you can control that very tightly, okay, you're offering them a product, so part of that's the industry logic, right? If you offer people a coherent product that allows them to buy into certain things. But also, what is your model of community? Are we offering these people an experience that they then sort of come and go through every week? Do we want them to contribute to the formation of what we're doing? Do we want this person over there to say, actually, my life looks a bit different and I want that to be heard within our service, within our community? How do you allow those dynamics to emerge? And I don't know whether worship music and the worship music industry has sort of intentionally said, no, we don't want to hear any of that, because I think part of the logic is people can bring their experiences, their lives into worship in some ways. But I don't think it's fostered an experience that really, or an environment which really allows a lot of those processes to take place. And I think part of that's connected to the spirituality. So worship music is very connected to an intense desire to engage heartfelt worship with God and to encounter the Holy Spirit. And if you say that is the purpose, the goal, then a lot of that is shaped by very tightly controlling what that trajectory of musical experience looks like in the service. And if you have someone that says, actually, I'm bringing something else here, that has the potential to disrupt that sort of flow. And as soon as you're allowing them to disrupt that flow, that whole purpose is in a way brought into question. And so
That's really interesting though. So that the flow is more important than the expression of the individual, is essentially what, is that right?
I think
Is
so.
that what you're saying?
I think that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, which is really interesting because that's a reverse of our culture right now, right?
Maybe.
Well, the reason I say that is, if the right of the individual, the reason Smythe has been called out, Pilavachi was called out, the reason Fletcher's been called out, and so many others have been called out is because the value of the individual is more important than the flow. And what we have is a complete dissonance with traditional Church of England leadership, suggesting the flow is more important than the individual.
Yep.
Is that fair?
I think that's fair. Yeah.
So where do we go from here? And why I'm really interested in speaking with you, which is just really exciting, is you're managing in your language and in your scrutinization and your examination, you're looking at the distinction between worship music, church, theology, and then the culture of those things and where it's come from. So in some respects, I suppose the question is, where do we go from here? What value does contemporary worship have from an evangelical point of view or charismatic point of view? What value does it have now? So, and in some respects, the question at the moment that the church is going through is, do we act like a light on a hill, or do we act like salt in the meat?
Yep.
And so where the question that we've got about music is actually way more significant than I'd realised before, because this will actually enable that this distinction in style and taste also reaches into theology.
Yeah.
Whether that's same-sex relationships or leadership, or just merely I like electric guitar and a drum kit behind a perspex thing. So
yeah.
Where do we go from here? Where's your learning taking you?
Well, I think one of the first points, I mean, in terms of worship music, in terms of where can we go from here, the first thing to talk about is what we were talking about a little bit earlier, this sense that certain things are given and certain things sort of appear to always have been there, when in reality there are other options maybe. And so worship music, as we have it today, is a very recent phenomena, right? It emerged over the course of the 20th century, and we sort of saw worship music markets expand and become dominant. But now we sort of accept, okay, that's just how church is. This is what church does. Maybe it changes a little bit from time to time, but that's the norm within a charismatic environment. And increasingly, that culture is influencing the way music is done in even more sort of middle-of-the-road congregations.
Yeah.
And so I think the minute we start to say, actually, that's a really contingent way of doing things, it's not just how things are, and there have been other ways, then the question emerges, okay, could we do something different? Could we create something different? Could we say, okay, worship music brought us something valuable in terms of, for example, expressing emotions, allowing popular music within congregations, maybe even a certain democratization that anyone can pick up a guitar and worship.
In words of Radiohead.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, we can say it offered us something, and we're going to take the good from that, but now we've begun to see there's certain things it enables, certain good things it enables, certain bad things it enables, and certain good things which it doesn't enable.
So let's quickly look at some of those. So what are the good things and the bad things? What good things does it enable? What bad things does it enable? And I know you've covered some of that just then, but give us a little bit of an idea.
Right. No, I think the good things, are democratization, maybe a certain ability to express emotions in worship, a freedom to say the music of the everyday can be the music of the church. Those kinds of things I think are incredibly valuable. When you think of worship music perhaps as a reaction against church cultures which excluded a lot of the everyday culture and said, no, the rest of your life can't come in here, then it's enabled people to, I think, feel they can bring certain things into the church which previously
that's really interesting.
might not have been possible.
Yeah, so the Sunday best went out, didn't it?
Right.
And my grandma used to be petrified about the reverend visiting her house. It had to be perfect. She needed to be a lot cleaner than our house right now. So that kind of informality with church was brought in.
Yeah, and I don't think all church needs to be informal, but I think the permission to say, okay, church can be informal, I think that's really important to people, and I think has become just expected now.
And so then what would the negative be?
I think there's a lot of different ways we can get at the negatives. I think we can look at the fact that a lot of people feel a bit emotionally manipulated by worship music. They feel it's too intense, that it doesn't allow them the freedom of emotional expression they might have, or to express the full range of emotions that they might elsewhere, that they're pressured into a certain way of thinking or feeling there. I think we begin to see the way some of the industry dynamics become really problematic. Not that it's necessarily bad to sell worship albums, but the way those dynamics have developed and the way they put certain pressures on people, or people just start getting sort of slightly too attentive to their sales figures and what they're earning and what people want, all those kinds of things. I think these questions of musical diversity for me are really interesting ones. That there's a lot that worship music excludes, that it doesn't foster that sort of democratic musical culture that allows everyone to bring something different. It doesn't cherish that. It really says, no, that's not for here. And it doesn't allow a lot of talk about music either. I mean, my experience is that when people come with difficult experiences with worship music, often the way we talk about worship music really seeks to downplay those and say, yeah, okay, but do this thing. I think more recently we've seen some of the problematic ways that worship music and politics can become associated, sort of mediated through the question of spirituality.
It relates to politics. I hadn't got there before.
Well, I mean, we've seen there were some quite prominent worship music focused protests in the US over the course of the COVID pandemic. Sean Foyt from Bethel was leading sort of worship music gatherings outside against pandemic restrictions, but also then sort of leading into slightly nationalist claims for Christian power over the nation, maybe sort of also gesturing in that direction of Trump politics. And it's really interesting that worship music was something that sort of could feed into that. And why could it feed in? Well,
or an expression of that, right? So music's often an expression of, I mean, in America again, Vietnam War, and how music played such an important part against that. We see it in all the movies we still watch.
Yeah.
So that you're suggesting then that worship music was used as a
political tool,
kind of establishment thing.
Well, maybe not just anti-establishment, as a Christian nationalist thing, right? To say, okay, God's present in our worship. God's here as king. We're going to enthrone God. Yeah. What does it mean to enthrone God? Well, maybe it means electing Trump to the White House. I mean, very simply. Yeah. And there's other friends of mine that have done a lot more thought in that kind of area. Adam Perez has published some great articles sort of looking at that in more detail. I don't think worship music isn't necessarily inherently Christian nationalist, but it's certainly interesting that it can be used for that purpose.
And so in Britain we do everything in a more subtle way.
Yeah.
And that's kind of across the board, right? From America. And yet a lot of this, and I've read in your books, you know, a lot of what starts in America continues in Britain.
Yeah.
Whether it's I mean, it's just not. It just rarely is a mirror image, but it would be a sort of a copy-ish version. So, what could that look like here? What could a Christian nationalist worship movement look like in Britain? I mean, is there you establish which camp you're in with this music? Is that it, or is that already done and the music just is a?
I mean, I don't know whether we would necessarily expect it to be so explicit, but so.
I thought about that. I'm just going to interrupt again. So, based on the sort of music that you might put in your car or listen to on your phone, is there a sense that you're placing a flag in the ground as to who you are? So you could expect someone's theology or the way they view someone or the way they interact with a political thing based on the music they listen, the worship music they listen to.
I think so.
So then when the church chooses to use that type of music in their church, that church is agreeing and placing that same flag, or does the church lead what the individual says?
I mean, there's cultures where it comes together where it's perhaps easier to see where it comes together. So one of the examples, we've had all these scandals recently about the International House of Prayer in Kansas City. Right. Worship music is a big part of what they do in their prayer room, a lot of improvised worship music. A lot of their prayer culture is focused on quite apocalyptic themes. A lot of sort of prayer around the role of Israel, the end times, which inevitably works its way into the music, right? You're sort of singing things which are about those end time expectations or how they connect to the presence of Jesus.
Can you give an example of a line, or if it doesn't come to mind, then fine.
I mean, I haven't listened to that much of it. There's a lot of Misty Edwards songs that sort of stick in my head from there. Or things, there's one, there's a line in one of her songs, she just keeps chanting, "I can hear the roaring of the Lion of the tribe of Judah. I can hear the roaring of the Lion of the tribe of Judah." And it goes on and on with this sort of, okay, it's a very simple line. And you can say, okay, that this is a very spiritual thing. I can hear God sort of as this presence, but what does that imagination do to you? You're sort of imagining, okay, God is very active, perhaps very ferocious there, and what are you expecting him to do as you're singing that? In the context of the song, I think expecting him to do something quite political, quite global in scale.
It's very rhythmic in its syntax as well.
Right. Yes, and you sing that and you begin to feel it, you begin to believe it, you begin to relate to the world in a certain way, right?
Yeah, you do.
You begin to expect it. Okay, God's going to do something. Okay, what's he going to do? When's he going to do it? How am I going to be part of that?
So take that and then let's go slightly segue again. So then what's the role of worship, of that corporate worship within a church service or a celebration or a meeting time? What does it do, and what's its purpose?
Music does a lot of different things, right? Music manages your emotions. Music shapes your imagination. It shapes the way you relate to the people around you. It shapes what you're thinking and feeling. And because it sort of touches so many different core human and social dimensions, it can do a lot of different things, I think. It can encourage you to act in the world. It can make you feel empowered to act in the world. It can make you retreat into your own little space and say, okay, I'm going to be alone with my thoughts in this things, in this little inner world of mine. It can encourage you to interact with other people in really creative ways. It can give you a sense that God is there with you. It can give you that sense that no, God's miles away. It can do so much that I think that's why it's really important to ask questions of it. If music just did one simple thing and we said, okay, we're going to have some music here, and it's pretty obvious what music does, then we wouldn't need to talk about it or reflect upon it too much. It would just be, okay, here's the music, let's do it, or let's not do it.
And that isn't the case, and yet that's how we often look at it.
Right.
So what questions need to be asked? I think almost to wrap up, what questions do we, or churches, or those of us who are trying to figure out how do I go back to church, i.e. me, what questions need to be asked in order to untangle, rather than just treat it as I've heard so many people say, worship music or the tone triggers, right? It triggers a memory that or some of the things that people have struggled with. What questions do we need to ask? Because you said they need to be. So what can we ask?
When I've asked questions, I think a lot of the ones I start with, how are the people around me experiencing this music? What's it meaning to them? What are their musical values? What are their positive and negative experiences? What is music doing for them in this context? Because you talk to a group of people in the church, and the church has quite often a sort of corporate line as to what the music should be doing. Is there to help us worship God, or it's something very simple. But the minute you start talking to people in the congregation, you realize that they've got really quite a diverse set of expectation experiences and values surrounding that music. And some of them are good, some of them are difficult, some of them are in tension, some are really struggling with things. And for me, that's one of the first things to sort of think about. These people in front of me, what's this music meaning to them? And what are they experiencing? But I think we can also go beyond that. Yeah. Because that a group of people in the church, maybe they don't have this sort of big picture idea. Maybe they're just grappling with their own little experiences, and maybe they don't know how to imagine something different. A lot of them probably do. I think we downplay the expertise and level of reflection that people in the pews are capable of offering. But I think then we can also step back and ask these bigger questions. How is our music helping us to imagine the world? What alternative models are there? I think if we look outside worship music environments, we see so many different things that music can offer us and help us with. Recently I've been doing a lot of research on music in relation to the climate crisis. And there you sort of think, okay, there's this big thing we're addressing as humanity. Maybe that disrupts the way we think about music and what we think it should be offering us. How should it be motivating us to address certain issues? How should it be shaping our relationships to plants, animals, other aspects of creation? How does it help us to process questions of grief, loss, and despair? That brings with it a whole new range of questions. Yeah. And you think, okay, worship music, is it addressing those things? Should it be addressing those things? Can we have music that might be more adequate to those things? And then maybe these little sparks of creativity emerge, and we say, okay, our music could be doing something different. Maybe the people in our midst, maybe they need something different. Maybe if we're going to be a healthy community, we need our music to do something different. Maybe we don't need it to be this kind of intense emotional experience. Maybe we don't need this expectation that God somehow makes himself present towards the end of the worship set. Maybe that was a bit odd all along. Maybe that's not how we imagine the presence of God in the world, but we've slipped into that because of this kind of music.
Emotional response to music.
Well, so I did some research with some emerging church communities, and when I was talking to them, a lot of them are deliberately getting away from evangelical worship music models. And one of the things that came up in some of those conversations was, okay, actually we're getting away from this idea that we're sort of striving towards that transcendent encounter. We're going to begin with the sense, okay, God's already present in the world. And that's a really interesting change in mindset. If your music's sort of trying to make the presence of God manifest, then you're thinking, okay, I'm sort of, God's up there, we're sort of journeying to him. Versus if you begin your musical worship with a set, God's already present all around us, then that's really changing the way you relate to the world as a whole, not just musically. And the way your music is shaping your expectations of where God's to be found, what the value of the creation around you is, they're really deep questions.
Have we missed anything? Loads. But I mean, that was a great conclusion. But I'm happy. Is there anything else you want to?
I could ramble on for hours about lots of different things. If you're happy with that as a conclusion,
Yeah.
it's better not to.
It's great. It's really tight. Thank you.